So we were discussing the treatment of ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. The drugs which are used for remission include to induce remission include corticosteroids and mesalazine. In case of Crohn's disease, first line is prednisolone, while in case of ulcerative colitis, first line is mesalazine to induce remission. While to maintain remission, there are two drugs as well, azathioprine and mercaptopurine. We'll discuss them in the coming case. In Crohn's disease, the maintenance to maintain remission, the drugs are azathioprine or mercaptopurine. While in ulcerative colitis, the first line maintenance drug for remission is oral mesalazine. Mesalazine is available in two forms. Local mesalazine, which is used per rectally, and oral mesalazine. So local mesalazine or topical mesalazine to induce remission in ulcerative colitis, and to maintain remission, oral mesalazine. And if the patient does not get better with oral mesalazine, so now let me ask you questions. Anyone who want to answer can mute himself or herself and answer me. Yes, I can repeat it. Remember that the treatment of inflammatory bowel disease parts, first part is remission, to induce remission, second part is to maintain remission. Now, which drug is used, or what is the first line drug for the induction of remission in Crohn's disease? First line drug for the to induce remission in Crohn's disease. Induce mean to start the remission process. Induce mean to start the remission process, and to maintain means to maintain it. Is that right, Dr. Musharraf? Okay, whenever anyone want to ask a question, he or she can unmute himself and ask the question, so that in the recordings, for the one who are just listening to the recordings, they can know what have been asked and what is being answered. So what is the first line drug to induce remission in ulcerative colitis? Anyone? What is the first line drug to induce remission in ulcerative colitis? Mesalazine. That's right. Mesalazine, topical mesalazine. The first line drug to induce remission in ulcerative colitis is topical mesalazine. And which is the first line drug to maintain remission in ulcerative colitis? Oral mesalazine. That's right. That's right. What if the patient is taking oral mesalazine and for 4 weeks and he developed symptoms? What if there is no response with oral mesalazine in ulcerative colitis after 4 weeks? Then which drug you will use for maintenance of remission? If no response with oral mesalazine, then which drug will be used for maintenance of remission? Can anyone tell me? Azathioprine. Azathioprine, an immunosuppressive drug, azathioprine or mercaptopurine can be used if there is no response with oral mesalazine for 4 weeks. Azathioprine, that's right. Now, which drug is used to maintain remission in Crohn's disease? Which drug is used to maintain remission in Crohn's disease? Prednisolone is the first line drug to induce remission. To maintain remission, yes, right, that's right. For maintenance of remission, azathioprine is used. For induction of remission, prednisolone is used. In ulcerative colitis, azathioprine will be used for maintenance of remission if there is no response with oral mesalazine. Remember that. While in Crohn's disease, mesalazine is not that much effective. That's why we prefer prednisolone to induce remission, and for maintenance of remission, we use azathioprine or mercaptopurine. While in ulcerative colitis, to induce remission, we use topical mesalazine, and to maintain remission, we use oral mesalazine. And if there is no response with oral mesalazine after 4 weeks, then we will use azathioprine to maintain remission. Is that right, everyone? So this was all about Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, how to investigate it. Remember that there are two other laboratory findings which you will be given in PLAB 1 exam for inflammatory bowel disease. One is raised ESR. ESR will be raised because ESR is raised in every inflammatory condition. And one other marker for laboratory finding for inflammatory bowel disease, both for ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease, is fecal calprotectin. fecal calprotectin will be positive in inflammatory diarrhea, such as due to bowel disease, due to ulcerative colitis or Crohn disease. So in the exam, both of them can also be given for the diagnosis of inflammatory bowel disease. Fecal calprotectin and raised ESR. Our next topic is Barrett esophagus. Remember that normally the lining of esophagus is squamous epithelium. The lining of the inner lining of esophagus is stratified squamous epithelium. But if this epithelium is exposed to hydrochloric acid from the stomach for a prolonged period of time, such as that occur in a patient with gastroesophageal reflux disease, in which there is a reflux of stomach acid into the esophagus. What will happen if the lining of the esophagus is exposed to acid or stomach acid for a prolonged period of time? The epithelium of the esophagus, which is squamous epithelium, will change into columnar epithelium, because columnar epithelium is more resistant toward acids. That's why it's a defensive mechanism of the body that because of gastroesophageal reflux disease, the lining of the lower end of the esophagus is changed into, because only the lower end of the esophagus is exposed to acid. So the lining of the lower end of the esophagus will change into columnar epithelium. And this process is known as metaplasia. So the esophagus which have undergone metaplasia will be known as Barrett's esophagus. Barrett esophagus is a risk factor for adenocarcinoma of the esophagus. Adenocarcinoma means carcinoma which consists of a gland. And I already told you that columnar epithelium contain glands which secrete mucus. So that's why Barrett esophagus can result into adenocarcinoma of lower esophagus. Remember that adenocarcinoma of the esophagus is the most common carcinoma of the esophagus, other than adenocarcinoma of the other carcinoma which is can occur is squamous cell carcinoma. Squamous cell carcinoma usually involve upper 2/3 of esophagus, and adenocarcinoma usually involve lower 1/3 of esophagus, because only lower 1/3 of the esophagus is exposed to acid in gastroesophageal reflux disease. So first, the patient will have a history of gastroesophageal reflux disease. Then he will develop Barrett esophagus. Then he will develop adenocarcinoma esophagus. While squamous cell carcinoma of the esophagus is common in the upper 2/3 of the esophagus, and the risk factor for squamous cell carcinoma of the esophagus is achalasia. So gastroesophageal reflux disease is a risk factor for adenocarcinoma, and achalasia is a risk factor for squamous cell carcinoma. Now, our next topic is achalasia. Remember that in achalasia, there is autoimmune destruction of the nerves which supplies the muscles of the esophagus. As I told you that the GAT lining, the lining or the wall of GAT from esophagus to anus consists of five things. One is mucosa, second one is submucosa. In third and fourth layer, there are muscles, and the fifth layer is serosa. Usually, there is a nerve complexes or nerves are present in the muscular layers, which control the peristalsis movement. Due to autoimmune destruction of the nerves, there will be paralysis of the muscles of the esophagus. So, what will happen? Peristalsis will not be generated. So, there's paralysis of the muscles of the esophagus, due to which peristalsis will not be generated. As there is no peristalsis, so the person will have dysphagia for both solids and liquids simultaneously. Because anything, either it is a liquid or it is a solid, needs peristalsis to move forward in the GAT tract. And as there is no peristalsis, so the person, if someone has dysphagia for both solids and liquids simultaneously, progressive dysphagia for both solids and liquids simultaneously, then you will think of eclasia. But if someone has a mass in the esophagus, if someone has a mass in the esophagus, then what kind of dysphagia he will develop? Initially, when the mass is small, he will have dysphagia for solids only, because liquids can pass through a narrow opening because the mass is small. But as the mass grows larger in size, the person will also develop dysphagia for liquids as well, because it will obstruct the esophagus. So if someone has a dysphagia for both solids and liquids simultaneously, then you will think of eclasia. While if someone has a dysphagia initially for solids, then for liquids, then you will think of esophageal carcinoma. So the first manifestation of eclasia is dysphagia, progressive dysphagia to both solids and liquids simultaneously. And the second hint, for as the food is not passing from esophagus to stomach, so it will regurgitate. It will regurgitate and it can be aspirated into lungs, which will result in cough, fever, and pneumonia manifestations. So, what are the two manifestations? A person having dysphagia for both solids and liquids, and present to you with symptoms of pneumonia such as cough and fever. Then you will think of eclasia. The point more in favor of eclasia are dysphagia for both and solids and liquids simultaneously, and regurgitation. While the points more in favor of esophageal carcinoma is dysphagia initially for solids, then for liquids, weight loss, and the age of the patient will be old, while eclasia usually present in middle-aged men or women. One other thing that you need to differentiate between ecclesia and pharyngeal pouch. What is pharyngeal pouch? Pharyngeal pouch is basically an outpouching of pharyngeal muscles, mucosa of the pharynx between pharyngeal muscles. A pouch is formed in the neck. So the person will have dysphagia and regurgitation in pharyngeal pouch as well. Then how you are going to differentiate between ecclesia and pharyngeal pouch? Remember that in pharyngeal pouch, there will be bad breath and regurgitation of stale food or fluid. Regurgitation of stale fluid and bad breath or smell, and gurgling sound in the chest. These 3 points will favor more pharyngeal pouch. It is important to differentiate between ecclesia and pharyngeal pouch because in pharyngeal pouch, endoscopy is contraindicated. You will never perform endoscopy in pharyngeal pouch because it can lead to the rupture of pharyngeal pouch and it can complicate pharyngeal pouch. So what points that will point towards pharyngeal pouch in a person who present to you with dysphagia and aspiration pneumonia or a sign of lower respiratory tract infection? 3 points: regurgitation of stale fluid or food, bad breath or smell, and the third one is gurgling sound in chest or gurgling sound on palpation. And also he or she will complain of a lump in the neck because there is a pouch in the neck. So if a person tells you that he is having dysphagia and respiratory symptoms, plus he has a feeling of a lump in the neck, then you will think about pharyngeal pouch. The three conditions can present to you with dysphagia: esophageal cancer, ecclesia, and pharyngeal pouch. Esophageal cancer is very easy to differentiate because esophageal cancer, the patient of esophageal cancer will have either a history of GERD or Barrett esophagus, and he will be an old age person, and there will be weight loss, and dysphagia will initially be for solids and then for liquids, while a person with ecclesia will have dysphagia for both solids and liquids simultaneously, plus there will be regurgitation. While in pharyngeal pouch, along with regurgitation and dysphagia, there will be bad breath or smell, gurgling sound in chest, a feeling of lump sensation in the neck, and regurgitation of stale fluid or food because the food will be accumulated in the pouch and it will get rotten and then it will be regurgitated. So there will be regurgitation of stale or rotten food. So we were on ecclesia. Key points for ecclesia for the diagnosis of ecclesia is dysphagia for both solids and liquids and signs of respiratory tract infection.
So, what is the meaning of increased lower esophageal resting pressure?
As there is now how to diagnose ecclesia. The initial investigation to diagnose ecclesia is barium swallow, and the definitive investigation for the diagnosis of to make a diagnosis of ecclesia is manometry. How manometry will diagnose? And remember that in ecclesia, as I told you that there's destruction of the nerves, so there will be spasm of lower esophageal sphincter. The esophageal sphincter will not open due to spasm of lower esophageal sphincter. There will be increased resting pressure at the lower end of esophagus because of spasm of the muscles or lower esophageal sphincter. It will be closed, it will be in a spasmodic condition. So that's why the pressure at lower esophageal sphincter will be high. That we can that we can make a diagnosis on the basis of manometry, which basically measure the lower esophageal pressure. So silent symptoms: dysphagia for both solids and liquids, plus signs of respiratory tract infection. You will suspect eclasia. How will you investigate eclasia? Barium swallow. Barium swallow will show bird beak appearance because the lower esophageal sphincter is closed. That's why the proximal esophagus will be dilated and the lower esophagus will be narrow, which will result in a bird beak kind of appearance. And the definitive diagnosis to make and definitive investigation to make the diagnosis will be manometry. What will be the treatment of eclasia? The treatment of eclasia is myotomy, which is called Hiller myotomy. The name of the procedure or the surgery is Hiller myotomy. Or if someone cannot undergo a surgery, such as old age patients, then botulinum injection can also be used for the treatment of eclasia. So the treatment of eclasia is dilatation of the lower esophageal sphincter, and the name of the surgery is Hiller myotomy. And if someone cannot undergo surgery, then botulinum injection can also be used. Is there any questions anyone want to ask on this topic? Now, can someone from you read the example, the scenario, and see how they are going to ask eclasia in the tab 1? Anyone can read it? Dr. Shafraz, can you read it?
Yes, for sure.
Thank you.
45-year-old woman presents with productive cough and moderate fever. She also complains of central chest pain, regurgitation of undigested food, and dysphagia to both solids and liquids.
So in this scenario, a middle-aged woman presents with productive cough and fever. What is productive cough and fever indicating? They are indicating a respiratory tract infection. And also, along with signs of respiratory tract infection, there is regurgitation of undigested food and dysphagia to both solids and fluids. So someone with the signs of respiratory tract infection plus dysphagia for both solids and fluids, you will suspect eclasia. What will be the initial investigation for eclasia? Initial investigation will be X-ray, which will show mega esophagus, and barium swallow or barium will show bird beak appearance, just like a beak of a bird. And the definitive investigation for the diagnosis will be manometry, which will show increased lower esophageal sphincter pressure. How to differentiate eclasia from esophageal cancer. A person with esophageal cancer will present to you in old age, plus there will be weight loss, plus there will be history of smoking or alcohol because they are a risk factor for esophageal carcinoma. And the dysphagia will be initially for solids, then for fluids. Or other risk factor for esophageal cancer such as Barrett esophagus or history of GERD will be there. In eclasia, the diagnostic investigation was manometry, while in esophageal cancer, the diagnostic investigation will be endoscopy plus biopsy. The most common esophageal carcinoma is adenocarcinoma, while smoking is associated with squamous cell carcinoma. Now there is pharyngeal pouch, which we have already discussed. The main point that will point toward pharyngeal pouch is regurgitation of stale food or fluid, bad mouth breath or halitosis, gurgling sound in the chest. These are some points which will point towards pharyngeal pouch. And the fourth one is a feeling of lump in the neck. Now our next topic is villus adenoma. So far we have discussed three causes of chronic diarrhea in adults. What are those? Celiac disease, ulcerative colitis, and Crohn's disease. Now, villus adenoma can also cause diarrhea. How you are going to differentiate between the diarrhea of villus adenoma, or what are the clinchers for the diagnosis of a diarrhea which is caused by villus adenoma? Remember that adenoma, as its name indicates, it's basically a tumor of a non-cancerous tumor of or a benign tumor of glands of the enteric tract. Villi, more specifically. A benign tumorous growth of villi is called as villus adenoma. So if someone presented to you with excessive watery diarrhea plus large amount of mucus, the diagnostic point for villus adenoma in history is large amount of mucus. So if someone present to you with excessive watery diarrhea plus large amount of mucus, your diagnosis will be villus adenoma. The diet of villus adenoma is surgery. And what are the complications of villus adenoma? Because of loss of potassium and bicarbonate ion in the diarrheal fluid, the person will have metabolic acidosis and hypokalemia. Because diarrhea will result in the loss of potassium and bicarbonate ion, so the person will have metabolic acidosis and hypokalemia. One other point or one other complication of villus adenoma is as it secrete a large amount of mucus which is rich in protein, so it can also cause hypoproteinemia. How it is diagnosed? It is diagnosed by colonoscopy. And what is the treatment of villus adenoma? The treatment of villus adenoma is surgery. What are some important other causes of hypokalemia? The most important ones are diuretics such as loop diuretic and thiazide diuretic, Cushing syndrome and Cohn's syndrome are other two important causes. Bartter syndrome as well. So, how to remember the causes of hypokalemia? The causes that are associated with enteric tract are diarrhea and vomiting. Diuretics, which can cause hypokalemia, are loop diuretic and thiazide diuretic. And endocrinology or endocrinological causes of hypokalemia include Cushing syndrome, Crohn's disease, and Bartter syndrome. Now there's some causes of hyperkalemia that we will discuss in the chapter of endocrinology. Now, vitamin B12 deficiency. Vitamin B12 deficiency can occur in different conditions, and vitamin B12 deficiency will manifest as there are two manifestations of vitamin B12 deficiency. One is anemia, and the other one is the second manifestation of vitamin B12 deficiency is. Can anyone tell me what is the second manifestation of vitamin B12 deficiency other than anemia?
Paresthesia and proprioception.
Yes, that's right. Neurological manifestations such as paresthesia, numbness, loss of vibratory or position sensation. So anemia with neurological manifestation, these are the two important manifestation of vitamin B12 deficiency, because vitamin B12 is required for the formation of RBCs as well as it is required for the healthy regeneration of nerve cells. So whenever there's deficiency of B12, it will manifest as megaloblastic anemia or macrocytic anemia, plus neurological manifestation such as paresthesia, numbness, loss of